My name is John Diamond, and this is my colleague Mike Weiss. And we are from MDRC, from the Higher Education Policy Group. Some of you may have heard of MDRC. We've partnered with CUNY on a number of different evaluations, which Avram talked about, so I won't run through them again. We are both thrilled to be here today. We have really appreciated all of the partnership and all of the work that we've done with various CUNY community colleges, with the faculty, staff, administrators, and of course the students. We have really appreciated CUNY folks' willingness to try new things and experiment with new approaches and programs. So thank you very much for having us today, and we look forward to a continued partnership with CUNY campuses. So we're going to talk about kind of two things today. I'm going to start, and I'm going to talk about generalities, which I think is going to work well because you'll see my hands go all over the place when I talk. So I'm going to make sweeping statements, and my hands are going to sweep too, and there'll be this nice connection. You guys will be like, oh yeah, he's sweeping up there. And I'm going to talk to you about two big categories of evaluations, and then four things that we at MDRC like to think about when we're starting a new research design or a new program evaluation. And then we'll shift gears a little bit to talk about MDRC's evaluation of the CUNY ASAP program. And Mike will take over, and we're hoping that ASAP can serve to provide some sort of concrete examples of the general things that we're talking about in the first half. And just out of curiosity, a quick show of hands now. How many people here have heard of ASAP before? Great. Wow. Okay. Terrific. So somewhere around 80, 90%. That's great. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is two big categories that we think of when we think of evaluations. And before I get into them, I was looking at the folder that you all have, and our categories are here in your handout. So I was totally pumped to see that because we are like in alignment with Effie and Avram and everybody else who's been organizing this. So some of the things that I'm going to say you probably already know or you've probably already read about in the materials. The first category that I wanted to talk about is formative evaluations. You may also hear this referred to as implementation research or process research or a process study or things like that. And formative evaluations are really about understanding whether the program that you ended up implementing really matches the program that you wanted to implement. So when you're launching a new program or a new study, as with so many other things, challenges come up and obstacles present themselves, and sometimes the thing that you end up implementing doesn't exactly match what you plan to do. And so formative evaluations are really thinking about the ways in which you did or did not succeed in implementing each component of your program. So at the end of the year or at the end of the semester or whatever the relevant time period is, which things really went off without a hitch and you have exactly what you wanted and you have exactly what you planned to do, and where were there hitches or obstacles or maybe problems with communication and you ended up compromising or you ended up doing something a little bit differently than you'd planned to do. Formative evaluations work really well for like a pilot study because you can do great formative assessments and great formative analyses with a very small number of students. So you don't need a lot of research money. You don't need a large sample. You can do it with 1 or 2 classrooms, but get a feel for where the problems are in terms of implementing your program. Formative evaluations also can work very well. You can think about the types of students that your program is serving and the types of students that you intended to serve. So are you finding the students that you meant to get services to or not? The second type of evaluation is a summative evaluation, and I think this is probably what a lot of people get excited about when they start thinking about program evaluation. I mean, obviously everybody here gets excited about all aspects of program evaluation, right? I can tell you guys are like giving off program evaluation vibes. But, for people who are not in the know when it comes to program evaluation, they may get more excited about summative than formative because summative is where we get to talk about outcomes. And summative is where we really get to talk about, is the program helping students in the way that we want it to, whatever those outcomes are, whether that is whether that's the number of students who pass a class or the number of students who get a degree or whatever outcome we're looking at. A summative evaluation is really looking at data around those outcomes and thinking about, is it having an effect? There's a challenge that we all face with summative analyses or evaluations. And I'd like to illustrate with a simple example, a non-pedagogical or education example. And that is, let's say that you are going to do a summative analysis of a weight loss program. And you find 100 people who are interested in participating in your program. And you're going to run the program for 3 months. So in November, you get everybody's weight and you start doing the program. And then in January, at the end of the program, you collect information on their weight a second time. And by January, everybody's weight has gone up by 2 pounds on average. So I'll turn to you guys. Does anybody have any thoughts on what kind of conclusions you could draw from this increase in weight, increase in average weight of 2 pounds over 3 months? Yes, thank you. Yeah. So you all immediately figured it out. It was not a very difficult test because you guys all aced it. The holidays are in there, right? And so people are eating a lot of rich, fatty, delicious food, because otherwise why do we bother having the holidays if not to eat things that taste great? So it's really hard to draw a conclusion about the efficacy of the weight loss program. Sure, people's weight went up, but it doesn't seem fair to say, oh, well, the program made them gain weight. If anything, we might hypothesize maybe their weight would have gone up even more in the absence of the program. And this gets to, here's my first buzzword, or my next buzzword, maybe I've already used a few today. Here we get to the idea of the counterfactual. And this is a persistent challenge for researchers who are doing any kind of summative evaluation. And the counterfactual is thinking about what would happen to your program participants, your students or whoever else, in the absence of the program, and what would their outcomes be had they not participated in the program. And it's a tricky problem because you can't really view them both when they participate in the program and when they don't. And so there's different types of summative evaluations that have different ways of dealing with the counterfactual, and Mike will address some of those later when we're talking about ASAP. So before I move on, I'll get to the next slide. I just wanted to say 2 other things about formative and summative. One, you don't have to do one or the other. A lot of great pieces of research can pull from both categories. You can have some formative analyses and some summative. And in fact, we'll have an example of that. And then the second thing is just one more plug for formative analyses. I think summative stuff is really sexy because that's what gets the headlines, right? When you read a headline like such and such program doubled the number of students getting degrees, or it increases student math learning, or it does all of these really exciting things. Those are all summative statements because they're talking about outcomes and they're talking about program efficacy. But formative is like the unsung hero of program evaluation, because if you don't know what kind of program you're really implementing and you don't know whether you're implementing the program that you meant to, then it's going to be really difficult to draw any kind of conclusions from your outcomes data. So don't forget formative when you guys are thinking about your own research proposals and research designs. Whatever type of analyses you plan to do and whatever type of evaluation you plan to have, there are 4 things that we like to keep in mind when we are planning new evaluations. And again, actually, I'll just put them all up at once. They match pretty well with the things on your worksheet already, which is great. These are things, we've listed them in an order here, 1 through 4, and that's the order I'll read them. But you don't have to do them in this particular order. These are things that we like to come to and then come back to again and again many times to try and sort of edit and revise and refine, because we find that they really help clarify our thinking later on when we are collecting data and when we are thinking about how to interpret and ultimately draw conclusions about the program that we're evaluating. So the first one is to identify the problem that your program is meant to address and barriers that may be causing that problem. The second one is to develop and define your program model. Which services are you going to offer? What are you going to do? Who are you going to do it for? The third is to identify what we call research questions, which are just the questions that you hope to be able to answer when your research is all wrapped up. And then fourth is to think about what types of data do you want to collect, and what kinds of analyses do you want to run on them. And we try to approach these at MDRC when we're doing this sort of program evaluation work. We try to iterate through these. So we'll come up with an initial answer to many of these questions, but then we'll go back and we'll revisit it. And we'll revisit it again. And we find that it's helpful to be as clear and explicit and detailed and specific as we can when looking at each of these. I think it may be easy to look at them and think, oh yeah, I know what the problem is, or I know what my program's gonna be. But the more details you can provide early for yourself, early in the program design process, the easier it will make your life later on. And we also find that it can be really helpful to bounce some of these sorts of things off of someone else who's not as deeply involved in the project, and really ask them to be kind of a skeptical, maybe critic or editor, someone who will challenge you on your answers to these things and the questions that you're posing, and saying, are you really posing the right question? You know, could there be an alternate explanation here, before you then dive in and spend a whole lot of time developing or working with a particular program model. So I realize that last slide was probably a little bit vague. So we're now going to spend the rest of the presentation walking through CUNY's ASAP program and using it to illustrate some of these points. MDRC did an evaluation of CUNY ASAP, but it's important to note that this is CUNY's program. So we were not involved in the development of the program, and when we came to this, it already sort of had been fleshed out. So some of the next couple of slides will ask us all to think about hypothetical answers to some of these questions that at a stage where MDRC was not yet involved in the process, but I think it still works as a useful example for purposes of this presentation. And I'll also note our evaluation of CUNY ASAP included both formative and summative pieces, so it's kind of a good example for purposes of this presentation. So the first thing on our slide with 4 steps was to think about the problem and barriers that might be causing that problem. So for CUNY ASAP, problem could be stated as low rates of degree completion among low-income CUNY community college students. So that's our problem. So what are the barriers that could be leading to this problem? So I'll just click through all of these, which really all of you already came up with. We had information, which several people touched on, things like which services are available, alignment of courses with goals, time, whether that's work or family or friends or anything else. Learning course content, which could be pedagogy, class structure, curriculum, money, things like tuition and fees, books, transportation, housing, food, family. And then psychological, which some people also touched on. That could be level of interest or motivation, grit or tenacity. So you guys are so good at coming up with barriers that it's going to make the next part of this presentation a little bit difficult, but I'm going to do it anyways, and you guys can bear with me because you're kind of already there. So what I was going to talk about was how these categories here, we had these 4 key steps before, right? And the first one was come up with problems and barriers. And then a couple of slides ago, I was talking about how it's helpful to go back and revise and edit and be really clear and really specific. A lot of the examples you guys gave were already pretty specific, which is good. I was going to actually point out how some of these things that I'm putting up in the slide are really not specific enough, right? And point the finger at myself here. For example, information. You know, when we have this item in here, which services are available or are not available. But as you all have already pointed out, that is kind of a general category that could hide several different and really distinct problems. So somebody already mentioned language, you know, and ESL students. Maybe it's not that services, maybe it's not a question of whether information is available or not, but maybe it's really about information being available in a student's native language. Somebody else mentioned, I think a couple of people mentioned, you know, comfort with college and comfort with going to use services. So that's another reason that people may not make use of services, which is, again, completely different from if it's a language barrier or if it is just that they're unaware of the services. So here on this slide, this sort of represents a good starting point. But within each of these bullets, you could imagine that there are several very distinct things underneath each of these, and depending on which one you think is really the problem, you may end up with a very different intervention or a very different program. So So when we are talking about, iterating and going back and defining the problem again and again, and maybe defining a problem and then developing a program model and going back and thinking some more about your problem and the barriers that you identified, you really want a good correspondence between the barriers and the program components. And so it's helpful to be really clear with yourself, which aspect of these barriers or problems am I really interested in? And is there a subcategory here that I think is really the most relevant one? Or do I have my categories right? So we have time and money, both listed here. And then we have family, and really family and work could fall into both of those. So maybe time and money are not the most helpful categories to think about. Maybe the real barrier here has to do with work. So it's helpful to kind of go back and revise, and here's where having someone else involved as someone to bounce ideas off of and really question what you're putting forward can also help you clarify for yourself what you're thinking of. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk more about what we did for ASAP.
Thanks, John, and thanks to everyone for participating and thinking of what all those barriers were. So one of the things I think John was trying to get at is this need to, you first are identifying all these barriers and problems, and then you're probably developing a program that tries to address some of those barriers, probably not all of those barriers. And I'm going to actually talk to you about ASAP, which is this program that's designed to try to help students graduate within a 3-year time period. And it's sort of unique in that it actually tries to address quite a few of those barriers that were listed on the previous page. And I don't want sort of people to feel discouraged when you're thinking about your own programs, that there oftentimes are a long slew of barriers that you list, and most programs don't actually try to be comprehensive and address every single one. Some of them really try to hone in on fixing or helping students with 1 or 2 barriers, not, I don't know how many, there are 20 different things that are listed on this slide. So ASAP is sort of unique in that way. In order to make this presentation a little more valuable, hopefully, I'm going to focus in. First, I'm going to give you a broad overview of just the whole program, which again, MDRC didn't develop, but that CUNY developed, and try to help you think about, or you can think in your head actually as I'm going through them, how these program components link back to some of those barriers that we discussed. And then I'll be really explicit and just go through one particular component, and I'll sort of walk through the entire process from what barriers do we think that this component might address, what research questions might you ask when trying to study the program components that try to address, or the program component that's trying to address this barrier. And then also I'll go through the fourth part of what John said to do, collecting data and analyzing it, again, specific to this one program component, which maybe is a little more in line with what some of you might try to do in a evaluation that's more C3 IRG size in nature, because the ASAP evaluation that we did was really kind of large and fairly expensive relative to the types of grants that are offered as part of the program. So, all right, so with that background, ASAP is a cool example because, as John noted, it's both formative. Our evaluation of ASAP is a good example, I think, because it's both formative in nature and summative, so we'll talk about that a little bit. And again, I'll just walk through, for now at least, what is the ASAP program, big picture, to sort of all the components. So there's a lot of them. There's a bunch of financial supports, and you all mentioned money as being a potential barrier, and I think somebody mentioned transportation. So ASAP actually provides a tuition waiver for students that covers any gap between the total amount of tuition and however much is covered by Pell and state aid and things like this. So it waives the rest of the tuition. It provides free monthly Metro cards to students. That might help out with things like transportation. And it provides students with textbooks as well for free, and it does this for 3 years. It also provides a whole bunch of student support services. And the one I'm going to focus on going forward after this is the advising component, and how MDRC sort of did our kind of evaluation of thinking about that one component at least. But it provides advising to students, it provides tutoring to students, and it also provides a career specialist who can help people think about their careers. Then there's also certain course enrollments you're supposed to be in if you take part of ASAP. There's a seminar that teaches things like study skills for students that perhaps don't have the best study habits. And it also teaches things like time management and things like this. And then there's also an intent that students who are in ASAP will form a cohort and take some classes together so that there might be peer support. And then also that the classes that they take, they try to make them so that they're scheduled in a block so that you don't have to spend quite as much time on campus. You can take your classes back to back. And then last but not least, there are some requirements and messages that are part of this program. To be part of it, you have to be a full-time student. Or at least you have to agree to participate full-time. They strongly encourage students that have developmental needs, so the students that take a placement test and don't do well enough, they require them or strongly encourage them to take these developmental education classes early, so right when you start school. And then they're fairly consistently given this message that you can and you will graduate within 3 full years. So that kind of broadly is an overview of the ASAP model as it is designed or planned. And part of what we did in our evaluation was try to understand things like, did that stuff actually happen? That's sort of what they hoped would happen or planned to have happen. And then also sort of what were the effects longer term. So some formative stuff and then some summative stuff, what were the effects on graduation? And I'll sort of walk through some of that now. So the barrier, or one barrier. So for many students, and this actually came up at the table that I was sitting at, there's a barrier to life, to college life, which is just understanding how to navigate life on college campuses, especially where ASAP operates, which is at the 6 CUNY community colleges. It's not at the new community college. There's many students who are first in their family college goers. In fact, community colleges nationwide serve a disproportionate percentage of first and family college goers. And they might just wonder somewhat basic things like, what courses should I take? How do I fill out the financial aid form? What support services does the college offer? What are the graduation requirements? Many things like this. But at least nationwide, on average, the typical advisor to student ratio is 444 students. That's the blue squares and circles. Those are students for every 1 advisor, right? So you might wonder how much advising can you really expect if this is the advisor to student ratio that you get. Now, bringing this back to John's mentioning of the counterfactual, or sort of what do students get when they're sort of not in ASAP, well, this gives you a hint as to what the counterfactual is. It's probably not a whole lot of advising because there's only 1 advisor for every 444 students. Notably, that number is nationwide, so probably a better depiction of what might happen would be for a program operating in CUNY is, well, what's CUNY's student to advisor ratio? So that would probably be, like, this is, I don't know, I use this in presentations, but it'd probably be a more accurate thing to know. At CUNY, what is the typical student to advisor ratio? So the ASAP program, what it offers, at least at the time when MDRC studied it, it's actually changed a bit since our evaluation began, but they offered 1 advisor for every 80 students, so better. And in addition, there was a requirement as part of the program that you have to go to those advisors at least 2 times per month. And to try to incentivize that to actually happen, those monthly Metro cards that I mentioned a few slides ago, they're contingent upon you going twice a month. So there's sort of built in an understanding that you tell students to do things, they might not actually follow through, and oftentimes the students that don't follow through are actually the ones that maybe need it the most. So to try to, sort of integrate the components of this intervention or program, they say, you gotta go to advisors twice a month or else you're not gonna get your monthly Metro card. So what I've just described, at least to some extent, is a more detailed description of the advising component of ASAP. It has a pretty well-defined student-to-advisor ratio. 80-to-1 is what you're supposed to have. It says, at least in terms of how much advising students are getting, it's pretty explicit. You got to go twice a month. It's pretty clear, quantifiable type of thing. It's a little less prescriptive in terms of some other ways you might think about a program component, like advising. Again, remember, this is one of many components. But it tells you how much, but they're not particularly prescriptive of what should happen in those advising sessions. What content might you cover? How should that advising be delivered? Does it have to be in person, face-to-face? So it turns out that model just doesn't have such a script prescription, but it would be actually easier for sort of an evaluator if it was really clear, because then we could check, are certain topics being covered in advising? They didn't do that, so it makes it a little bit harder to think about if you wanted to sort of know, are they doing what they said they're going to do, if they're somewhat vague in terms of what they say they're going to do in terms of the exact topics that should be covered or something like this. But let's keep going on. So that was a definition of one component of a program. We talked about the barriers, we talked about the program. That was sort of step 2 in John's list. Now, identifying some research questions. And now I'm just going to talk about these sort of formative research questions that we asked. And specifically with respect to advising, we asked similar kind of questions about all those other different components. This is a pretty big study. But we asked things like, is there fidelity to the ASAP advising model? And when you think about fidelity, it should be to something. So it has to be that there was some set of plans, and then we're sort of trying to see, did that stuff actually happen? And the clearest way that we could sort of look at that in a study like this is, well, 1, did they actually get that 80-to-1 advisor to student ratio? So we know how many advisors there were, we know how many students, did they achieve that? 2 might be, how much advising did the students get? Did they actually attend 2 times per month if they were in the program? Then there's also the second research question that we ask, which is, well, and this is that counterfactual thing that John was getting at, which is, how do ASAP students experience advising compared to what would have happened to them had they not been part of ASAP, right? So we want to try to answer this question, and we might try to answer that with respect to similar categories of ways of measuring advising. So how much advising would they have gone to had they not been part of ASAP? We might try to figure out something about the content of that advising. Is it different, despite not being explicit in the model about what advising is? Maybe just by going more often, going twice a month, you end up covering more topics. So we might want to try to understand, if you're in ASAP, do you cover different stuff than you would have covered had you not been in ASAP? So those are the kind of questions that we wanted to answer with this study, in part to help ASAP understand, are you sort of meeting your goals here? And then in part because it's, if they meet those goals and those services are very different, that they then expect students will be more likely to do things like graduate later on. So the next of John's 4 steps were to think about collecting and analyzing data. So in this case, there's a whole bunch of different data sources that you in theory could use, and we used quite a few of them. I'm going to focus just on one, which was a survey that we offered students, but I'll just talk through each of them. So you could survey advisors, you could survey students, and you could ask them questions about what happened in their advising. You could do interviews with students and or focus groups with students and or advisors. You could actually observe advising sessions. Personally, I wouldn't necessarily advise that, because you can imagine what they call like a Hawthorne effect, where, you know, if there's a one-on-one advising session and I'm some researcher in a lab coat coming in and I come and watch, like probably what you're going to observe is not really going to be a good representation of what actually happens in an advising session when I'm not there. So maybe not the best way to collect that kind of data. And if you're lucky, you can get administrative records data. You know, at some schools they actually have swipe card systems where before you go to an advisor, you swipe in and swipe out, and then you'd know exactly how many times everyone in my program went or my control. And in other studies, we've used that kind of a data source. Important to note, just as a little side, is that to collect especially things like administrative record data, you might have needed to get students to consent, because these records might not necessarily be, well, they're definitely not publicly available, and you might need to check with your institutional review board to make sure it's okay to actually collect that kind of data. You can't just go grab it. But I think that might have been discussed at other points today. No? Yeah, maybe. Okay. All right. So let me just show you some results from at least our study with respect to this one component and trying to answer those questions that I laid out. So we asked students on this survey that we gave them 1 year after they began the program. Simple, very simple, basic questions, which I think are smart to do on surveys, because I don't know, I don't necessarily trust that the students are going to interpret things right if I try to ask really complicated questions. So we asked very basic things like, during the past semester, how many times did you go to advising? Then during the past, the semester before that. And in the first year, on average, students that were in ASAP said they went around 38 times. Do I believe that that number is right? Definitely not. I'm sure they misremembered a lot. But is it probably around a ballpark of what is true? I hope so. I mean, it's probably not perfectly right, but it's probably somewhere in the range. You know, maybe they went between 30 and 45 times. Not exactly 38, but it's probably at least okay, I think. When I think about this with respect to the research question I listed earlier, is there fidelity to the ASAP program model? Well, remember, their plan was students should go twice a month. So if there was 9 months that they were in school, maybe it's 12 months over the course of the year, they should have gone 18 or 24 times on average, you would think, if they were sort of meeting the plans of the program. 38's well above that. Even though I don't believe the 38, it's like enough above that I'm thinking probably they did a really good job actually with respect to that program component. It might have actually been a better question to ask, not the average number of times, but we could have looked at what proportion of students actually went 2 or more times, because that's really what ASAP's plan had to do with. And I think we've done that in other analyses, but I don't present that here. To get a sense as to why you might want to do this, well, one, like now ASAP feels good. Yes, we're doing this as we said we would. But you can imagine like an alternative world where they weren't doing such a good job, and maybe you got these survey results back and you saw 8. You know, you said on average they went 8 times, and now you're thinking, God, there's not fidelity to this model. They didn't really do what they set out to achieve, and this would then be really important for you to know as someone who's running a program. We wanted everyone to go, twice a month. They're going much less than that. What is going wrong? Like, should we talk to advisors? Maybe you do interviews then with advisors and students. Why aren't you going? Maybe you need to set up a system that actually, alerts advisors towards the end of the month which students haven't actually come twice, so they then, know to reach out to them. But it just suggests a lot of possibilities of ways you might tweak your program or change it, but only if you know I'm not actually meeting my goal, which is why these formative assessments can be really, really useful. So then the second question that I mentioned that we tried to get at was, well, how is this different from how these students would have gone to advising if they weren't part of ASAP? Maybe it turns out that CUNY advising is like amazing and always people go 38 times. So in this particular study, which I think is probably unlike what a lot of other people will do, but as a part of a large-scale study, we actually had 900 people that participated in the study. And when they came in, they said, I'm really interested in ASAP, but we knew at the 3 colleges that the program was operating, there wasn't enough room for 900 people. So to determine who got into the program, we used essentially a lottery. It's called like a random assignment study. You may have heard of this. It's the way clinical trials are done in medicine. And so what we do is we sort of flipped a coin and through a lottery system determined who ended up in the ASAP program and who ended up in what we call a control group. And they sort of represent what would have happened to the ASAP students had they not been in ASAP, because the only reason they ended up not in the program was just because of the flip of a coin. And in fact, we can compare their characteristics, in terms of their background, gender and race and financial need and any characteristics we had on them. We could look and compare, and you see they're almost identical because the only reason one ended up in one group was because of this flip of a coin. So they serve as a sort of proxy for what would have happened to the ASAP students had they not been part of ASAP. And what we see is for them, this control group, they went on average around 6 times. So it's not that there's no advising going on if you're not part of ASAP, but you don't get anywhere near as much. And so this difference, around 32 or so times, that's sort of the added number of times that you think that ASAP is causing students to go to advising. And again, I don't believe that 32 is like an exact right number. They're going a lot more. Maybe it's 25 times more, maybe it's 40, but it's a lot more, and it's part of what's going to contribute to any later effects on outcomes that we're seeing later on. Does this all make sense to everyone? Okay. So in order to try to make this more relevant to sort of like pedagogical research, you might be thinking, well, if I am providing some new approach to pedagogy or something, whatever type of intervention you might be doing, it's a little harder to quantify things that aren't just how many times did I go. But so we also asked on the same survey questions more about the content of what happened in those advising sessions, which you can imagine if you try to do a pedagogical intervention and you survey your students, you might ask them more about things that happened in your classroom, what happened in there. So we asked questions about different topics that were discussed in advising, which maybe is a little more analogous to what you might do in a pedagogical project. We asked them a whole slew of things. Just, did you ever, in any of your advising sessions, talk about this topic? And again, we asked it to the program group and the control group. And we can see things like, with respect to job opportunities, 46% of students at ASAP said, at some point during my time with my advisors, I talked about job opportunities. Whereas in the control condition, what sort of would have happened otherwise, they only talk about this type of job opportunities around 16% of the time. And this is a really interesting example because you can see if you're part of ASAP, you're more likely to talk about job opportunities. But if you're part of ASAP, still 54% of people never talked about job opportunities any of their sessions. So had it been an important part of the ASAP model that you should talk about job opportunities, there'd be a lot of room for improvement. Now, it's not necessarily, some students probably don't need to worry about jobs at the point in time when they're in school, so they probably wouldn't call this problematic, but you can imagine if your program was trying to address the issue of working while in school, you'd kind of hope that that 46 was higher. You'd feel good probably that it's much higher than is happening otherwise, only 16%, but you might think about how you could actually maybe you try to train advisors and tell them you got to make sure in session number 2 that you talk about job opportunities. Just to go through a couple other examples, with respect to college services, things like tutoring and financial aid, you're much more likely to have talked about that with your advisor at some point if you're part of ASAP than if you are not part of ASAP. And this is sort of interesting because one of the program components was tutoring, and we actually asked questions about tutoring as well, and we find that ASAP students go to tutoring a lot more. So this might, you kind of might be tying things together here a little bit. You go to advisors, they talk to you about other services like tutoring and financial aid, and students actually are going a lot more often to get those services if they're part of ASAP. Another interesting example is we asked them, did you talk to advisors about course selection? And here you can see, yes, almost everyone in ASAP does. But guess what? So does everyone else. That's what normal advising sort of does. And if you go pretty infrequently, like they do in the control group, they're going to talk about this topic anyway. So this gives you a sense, this isn't really sort of a new thing that's being added on by ASAP. That happens probably anyway. Now, it might happen more often in ASAP because they're attending so many more times. But certainly, at least at some point, everyone pretty much is talking to an advisor about course selection. So. All right. So that's all I was going to say about the formative part of the evaluation. We did similar kinds of analyses and things with all of those different program components, but you can read our report that's going to come out in a month if you want to know about all those details. The summative part of the evaluation focused a lot on questions like this. How do CUNY low-income students, that was the target population of the ASAP program, and in fact, if I was more precise, it would say, how do CUNY low-income students with 1 or 2 developmental education needs, because that's exactly who we targeted in this evaluation, fare academically when offered ASAP compared to when offered their regular services. And in this evaluation, we looked at things like, retention rates, credit accumulation, and then ultimately in the longer term, we looked at graduation rates. To collect this data, to go back to John's, step 4, what data do you collect? So that's the research question. And you saw all the program components that address the barriers question. Data, we looked at things like CUNY transcript records, which provide things like, are you enrolled at any of the CUNY colleges across the entire system? That includes the 2 and 4-year schools. And then it also provides, so in addition to enrollment, it provides what courses you took, your grades, how many credits you earned. And then we also looked at the National Student Clearinghouse data, which provides you information about enrollment rates and graduation, or enrollment and graduation at pretty much any school across the country. I think they include, John will know this better than me, but 90 or 95% of institutions across the United States have information on student records for enrollment or graduation. Is that the right percent? Something like that. So that's the data sources that we use to do this. And here's the 2-year degree results. So for students that were in ASAP, their graduation rates were 15%, at least in our study, at the 2-year mark. One thing I want to say is, one of the suggestions was, wouldn't it be cool if throughout CUNY we knew what was the graduation rate for students with 1 or 2 developmental needs, and presumably you also meant like who also are low income, who kind of met the criteria to be part of the program. I don't know that number. It would be interesting to know, but I should say this. If you looked at that number and compared it to this for 2-year graduation rates, I would worry a little bit, because the people who came forward to participate in this probably aren't like all students that meet those criteria. In fact, there's something very different about them who participated in this. They found ASAP and came to it, or they had friends or whatever it was. There's something different that made them come and agree to participate in this study or in the program. So if you just compared the outcomes of other people who had sort of similar-ish needs, or similar in terms of developmental placement scores, or in terms of their income levels, there's a lot of other stuff. There's something different about the students that came forward to this, that they might have been more motivated, they might have been less motivated, maybe an advisor. You don't really know that they're perfectly comparable. So that information would be an interesting reference point, but I think the best reference point would be students who also were interested in this program, came forward, said they wanted to participate, and MDRC randomly assigned them to the control group, because they're exactly alike. They, in terms of all their observable characteristics, but also these things that are hard to measure or observe, or get some proxy of, like, real true skills measures, or motivation, or grit, or tenacity, things like this that are very sort of intangible or harder at least to measure, that you can't sort of match on in advance, but an experiment kind of guarantees you that they should look pretty similar. So with that being said, I'll show you the results from our control group, which I think probably is the best piece of information when you think about how would these students have done had they not been part of ASAP. So 8% of them would have graduated, 8% of them did graduate in our control group here, so around a 7 percentage point impact in terms of raising 2-year graduation rates. So pretty good, I would say. And CUNY operates ASAP at all 6 community colleges, not New Community College. This study took place at 3 of them, LaGuardia, BMCC, and KCC, and there were 450 students in the ASAP group and around the exact same number in the control group. And through some fancy statistics, you can sort of say our estimate of the impact is around 7 percentage points, and you can put sort of confidence intervals around that, but it's well above 0. It's highly statistically significant and things like this. For those that wanted to know how this looks at 3 years, we have that information. Don't tell anyone. This is not public yet. You're not supposed to be hearing this. Don't tell anyone. Wait for a month. We're going to release a report. But by 3 years, which was sort of the target time for graduation, the rates for ASAP go up to 40%, and the control group's at around 22%. So for around an 18 percentage point bump in graduation rates. It's probably still interesting to know what the national numbers are for 3-year graduation rates for this type of student. I don't think you can exactly get it, because I've at least never seen a data source that says for students with 1 or 2 developmental needs who are low income, what's the 3-year graduation rates. But you can find just sort of national graduation rates for everyone, but that includes college ready and people with more needs. And I think that they're in the 30% range, but don't quote me on that either. You should go to the National Center for Education Statistics if you want to like get the right number there. But thanks for your time. I hope it was helpful in some way.
Well, please join me in thanking